Hey there, loyal Hallway Conversations listeners. Dave here with a little peek behind the scenes of what happens when we edit episodes. Once in a while, we'll cut out some chunks of the conversation due to time constraints, because we recognize teachers' time is incredibly valuable and we try to keep our episodes to 20 or 25 minutes. But sometimes we wonder if the parts that we cut out might still be interesting to our listeners, and that's what happened this time. So you can consider this an extension of our last episode about redos. And we hope you might enjoy this bonus conversation. I'm going to play a little music and then we'll jump in. So I have a question for you guys. When you talk about responding to students' work, when you think about what you're doing when you're responding to students' work, how do you describe that? Do you call it grading? Do you call it correcting? Do you call it marking? Like what do you use for naming that? And I'll share my I tend to call it marking.
Yeah.
I had roommates when I was a student at university who were Canadian, and I think in Canada it's more common to call it marking.
Yeah.
It's less common here in the States.
When I think of responding, I think of feedback.
Okay.
But when I think of like putting a number on something, I think of it as grading.
Grading, yeah.
So I think of, so if I think about I teach Ed 300, and so in that class, there's a paper due every 2 weeks, 4 pages. And there is hopefully the module builds over, onto that or equips them in that and the readings and so I do need to put a grade on that. And so I have a rubric for that. But I would say I spend most of my time giving feedback, on the program that we have kind of in the margins. And most of the feedback I tend to give when I read those papers is often in the form of questions.
Oh, yeah.
So I don't often be like, well, no, I disagree. I mean, I have, but I often form it in the, like, hey, I notice, I wonder. Like, I noticed you said this. I wonder about that. So I just, because my hope is in asking the question, right, is just to say, hey, maybe this will stimulate some thinking. And I'm not naive to think that every question will do that, but
sure.
And then through those questions, like you have this rubric where you do have to put this kind of point in time assessment on it, but I do actually, and I've said to students, like, hey, if you want to take this feedback or these questions, and sometimes the questions are simply on what they said, but also the questions I might identify a gap. Hey, like, I wonder, have you thought about this? If they want to go back and redo and include or answer any of those questions within their paper, I'm totally good with that.
That you invite them into.
Absolutely. Why? You know why? Because I've never come up with a good answer to the. Why would I say no to that?
Sure.
Like, why would I say? And there's probably an answer to that, right? But in the end, it's like you have a student who takes the feedback they've gotten and takes the grade and says, hey, like, I think I can do better. I want to do better.
And that's what we ought to be about.
Totally. Here. And so that's why it's like, well, let's go for it.
I feel like I should tell you. So my question behind the question, I had another hallway conversation with some of our other colleagues, and literally we ran into each other in the hall. And at the end of our conversation, well, I'm going to go mark papers. And one colleague said, oh, that's interesting, because I call it correcting students' papers. And one said, oh, that's interesting, because I call it grading students' papers. And just, I wonder about this. I think the name that we use for it, like, am I correcting students' work, is different than grading that feels very evaluative versus, and I think of marking as similar to what you were saying, Matt, like I'm going to raise questions and I'm going to just notice, hey, this was really well said, or, I'm like literally marking their paper, right? And so maybe that's a piece of this too, to just be mindful of the language we use about some of these topics.
The more I teach, the less formal assessment of learning that I do. Isn't that interesting?
It is.
Why do you think that is, Abby? I'm just out of curiosity to put you on the spot.
Yeah,
sorry.
I think because, and again, I teach college students, so this is very different, right? But I think I trust students more, maybe, than I have before to do good thinking. And I've also grown my toolbox of ways to know that they're learning without some sort of piece of paper in a quiz or in a worksheet or in that to tell me. You know what I mean? So I think the more tools we have in our box with protocols and discussion frameworks and just even, like, I think of Small Teaching, the book.
Oh, yes.
Right? By James Lang. Just like knowing cognitive learning strategies to help students recall information.
Right.
Yeah.
The more I can design that into my actual classwork, the less I feel the need to gather formal evidence of learning.
Right.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
No, that makes sense. I would feel the same way about myself. I can remember, Dave, you might not remember this. We were coming back. We were walking across campus here with one of our colleagues, Rob, and he made a comment. He teaches, I think, environmental sciences, and he made the comment about how often he tries to set up his class to have students talking with each other. Because he's like, for him, that's where I think he used a line something like, this isn't word for word, that's where the real learning takes place.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you can't assess those conversations.
Yeah, right.
And if I think about that, and if I try to think about the discussions that we have in Ed 300 or even in breakout rooms on Zoom and some of the graduate, is like, I'm not privy to every one of those conversations, but as I walk around the classroom in Ed 300, I'm often struck, like there's a humbleness that comes about me to say, man, like they are talking about things with a depth that there's no way I can replicate through a lecture or even on a test. And that's not to diminish the test or a lecture,
Totally.
but it's like, wow, like listen to the conversations they're having. I mean, similar to us when we're in the hallway or having
right.
it's like, this is good like this is how we learn, and if it's true for us, might that not be true for our students as well, even in grade 2 or 3?
And that's what I was going to say. I think that's a piece that translates across any grade level, right? Like how do we structure things in such a way to get students naming the things that they're thinking about?
Yeah, and I think
and naming and owning their own learning.
That's right.
This is where I am.
Yeah.
In my journey towards this target, right?
Yeah, and maybe
and it's mine.
Yeah, and maybe to even ask them in that, where do you want to go? Like, this is where I'm at, and where do you want to go with that?
Yeah.
What do I know? What do I need to know? And I sometimes kids, they surprise us. I think they sometimes surprise us.
This podcast was quite literally dreamed up during one of our actual hallway conversations. Our music is by Ethan Mulder. Hallway Conversations is an independent podcast created and produced by Matt Beamers, Abby DeGroat, and Dave Mulder. Thanks for listening.